Have a look at this late 19th century photograph from Chicago. What you're looking at here is the city's lost National Guard Armory, a building that seemed to vanish from the public mind, and perhaps for good reason. You see, this armory was built by the state as the response to some rather unsettling affairs, only to later be exploited for commercial use before it was demolished altogether. But why? Why would Chicago remove such a grand example of historic architecture? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of Chicago's lost First Regiment Armoury. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. The First Regiment Armoury housed the Illinois National Guard, so for the sake of context, let us begin our story there. The National Guard of the United States is a military force comprised of soldiers from each state and 4 territories. Most National Guard soldiers do their service part-time while working a normal full-time job. These are essentially reserve forces organized by the state, ready to answer the call of duty should the Union need them. But in the beginning, things were different, as the militia was at the sole disposal of the state's governor. The president didn't have the right to take control of the National Guard until 1795. Also, on a final note, the term National Guard was not applied nationwide until 1903, and the first state to organize its militia as a National Guard was New York in 1824. In the interest of simplicity, we will refer to the Illinois militia as the National Guard, even though it didn't take that name until 1873. Surprisingly, the first militia organized around Chicago was French and carried over to the British after the French and Indian War. These units became American after the capture of Illinois in 1778 during the American Revolution, as the Commonwealth of Virginia absorbed the county of Illinois. After the cession of the Northwest Territory to the United States, the Illinois Territory formed, and with it, the militia. The Illinois National Guard saw action during the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and various conflicts against the Native Americans in the Midwest, which perhaps most notably was the Black Hawk War in 1832. None would hit the National Guard as hard as the American Civil War, after which the National Guard nearly vanished. For the 100th anniversary of the United States, the National Guard received 5,000 volunteers to celebrate. These troops received training from the Civil War veterans to bring them back up to proper standards. However, there was a big issue. These new National Guards needed specialized space for their equipment and training. This need became especially prevalent to the Guard after the controversial railroad strike of 1877, which turns out to be a key event in our story today. You see, the Great Railroad Strike was the first labor strike to spread across more than one state in the United States, and this all stemmed from railway workers who were upset that their wages had been cut 3 times in 1 year, with the latest one being 10%. So they organized a stop of trains and disrupted railway operations until the cuts were reversed. Originating in West Virginia, it spread to Maryland, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Mississippi. In Chicago, rail traffic halted after groups of railroad workers walked off the job at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Illinois Central Railroad. After sporadic violence, the Illinois National Guard was called in to dispel the crowds. Up to 30 were killed and 100 were wounded. This became a permanent stain on the Illinois National Guard's legacy, but it also highlighted the need for a permanent base, and so it was. Chicago would build its grand armory. Come 1889, discussions of an armory for the prestigious Chicago-based First Regiment of the Illinois National Guard had bore fruit. Plans emerged from the richest man in Chicago, Marshall Field, for a structure built in the image of a medieval castle. A castle of ramparts, bastions, and foreboding arches. A grim, solid structure on the west side of Michigan Avenue at 16th Street. This armory was very imposing, with 30 feet of heavy sandstone at the base, the remaining 45 feet of brown brick. It was meant to tower over its surroundings. The message was intentional, as pressure from the upper classes influenced politicians to create something intimidating, something that would prevent future organized worker uprisings. That intent was most blatantly on display in the first gate. You see, the first door to the armory was an actual portcullis made of chain and steel bars. It could be raised out of sight when not closed, but it could be kept just low enough to act as a toothy maw to the fortress. Right behind that gate was the drill floor, consisting of 150 feet by 168 feet of hardwood dark oak flooring, enclosed in walls of red brick rising to the second floor. The structure was not open air though, as a 120 by 70 foot skylight provided natural light to most rooms. Hanging over the drill floor were 2 floors of rooms, the second floor housing the colonels' and officers' quarters, as well as a mess hall with a kitchen and serving rooms attached. On the third floor were the company's lockers, a veterans hall, and a gymnasium that could serve as a hospital in wartime. Beneath the drill floor in the basement were 2 rifle ranges with 6 targets each, and the only other exit aside from the main gate. It should be noted here that as the structure was covered in so many gates, bolts, and locks, any attempt to force entry into any of the doors would have been impossible. The exterior walls were all 4 feet thick and furnished with all the trappings of a proper medieval fortress. There were rounded turrets featured on every corner, and in every window there were embrasure slots for firearms to shoot from without risk of receiving fire from the attackers. As construction was completed in 1891, a volume of inland architects described the structure as populous, quoting, "A pleasant feature is to be the social life in the armory. The floor of the main hall is of hardwood, highly polished, and will be kept in excellent condition for dancing. With this in view, the men will be required to wear rubber-soled shoes while drilling. The only feature requiring criticism is the hanging of the great main door. This weighs 12,800 pounds and is balanced by a large weight, making the entire strain 25,600 pounds, which is supported on 5 single pulleys attached to a light beam secured to the ceiling of the second floor." Despite its intent to intimidate, there was some surprisingly positive public feedback. One such reception was described by Donald Hoffman, who asserted, quote, "The sandstone masonry was magnificent, especially where the wall returned at the surroundings of the sally port, a detail reminiscent of the granite angles at the base of the rookery. In the brickwork, the first register of the stilted window openings was beautifully ordered by the relieving arches above the rifle slots below. Others drew comparisons to works of the past, such as one Andrew Robery, who painted a picture of, quote, an individual version of Romanesque in the free and romantic style, which aims not primarily at elegance, but at the effect of massiveness and vigor, and which has for its first object to break it upon the spectator's apathy." However, the positive reception was suddenly cut short in 1893, when just 2 years after its completion, the armory was devastated by fire. Not much documentation exists from this fire, but we do have photos. These images paint a grim sight. The drill floor was completely gone, the gate entrance blocked by a mound of rubble, and the brick exterior of the upper level, left of the gate, had also collapsed. The reason records of this devastation are so hard to come by is that the fort was reconstructed almost immediately. Reconstruction began in the summer of 1894 and ended by October of that same year, following almost exactly the same design of the original, with one exception, however. The portcullis that had previously closed the gate was replaced with a more traditional wooden gate. The initial construction of this building cost $185,000. Now that might not sound like a lot, but according to inflation, the cost of this building becomes $6,604,629.07 in today's money. That's still rather reasonable, since the old designs for the walls meant much less money had to be spent. Operating cost for the armory came at $20,000 a year, which translates to $714,013.95 in today's money. Of that, only $9,000, or $321,306.28 today, came from the state. The remainder of that had to come from the men of the regiment and rentals for the armory. The men were apparently quite fond of Chicago's armory. According to the Chicago Tribune, interviewed men of the Illinois National Guard would get very enthusiastic when describing it and their experiences within it, and it's not hard to imagine why. It was a modern-age castle in the middle of Chicago, after all. The armory had a long history of being rented out for various activities. For example, in 1906, an automobile show rented out the armory for use, setting up a collection of cars on the drill floor for display. In December of that same year, a charity ball was held on the same floor, with chandeliers strung from the skylights and second floor illuminating it even further. These rentals did concern some of the staff of the National Guard. As well, they needed to do these rentals to keep the lights on. The Guard was looking to expand, as the armory was currently expected to operate with 4 companies, and yet it had to scale back to drilling no more than 2 to leave room in the schedule for rentals. Despite this, all men occupying the armory agreed that the First Regiment needed to get up to full strength of 12 companies, 3 battalions totaling 1,256 men. As of 1894, they had only 875 men, but they had high hopes of reaching full capacity. Or as the Tribune put it, quote, "When the task is done, the 1st Infantry of the Illinois National Guard will be the biggest, strongest, most modern, best organized regiment in America. It already has the best armory." However, the armory would not remain so prestigious forever. Its last hurrah was the First World War, when it took on its intended purpose as a training and assembly ground for soldiers to be shipped out to Europe. But by then, other, more modern armories had already been constructed around Chicago, and these could accommodate all of the infantry regiments fielded by the Illinois National Guard stationed in the city. As for this structure, the state sold the property to private interests, making rental gigs its main purpose. And despite its grandeur, it didn't even see 50 years of service, as chronicled by one Mark Paul on the sale. August the 10th, 1940, the land beneath the First Regiment Armory at the northwest corner of Michigan Avenue and East 16th Street is sold by the estate of Marshall Field to the Standard Realty and Mortgage Company for an estimated $40,000. The sale is subject to a 99-year lease that Marshall Field made in 1890 with the 1st Infantry Armory Association at an annual ground rental of $4,000. Later depictions of the armory show it decrepit, covered in advertisements over its defensive fortifications, and a small for sale sign in one corner. This disgraceful sight was not to last either, as in 1967, Chicago's castle was demolished. The other armories constructed around the time of the Great War met similar fates. The only exception was the one that was granted landmark status and converted into a public high school. It's fitting that a structure built to intimidate and establish dominance over lower classes goes out with barely even a whisper. Details on this building were extremely difficult to come across, and a factor in that could very well have been the malicious intent behind its construction, when thinking back to the strikes and how the elite could prevent them. A relic of a bygone age in a land that never knew it, constructed to establish a feudal-like fear over its surroundings, fades into nothingness just 75 years after its creation. What was intended to be Chicago's own bastion became a host of shows and events for the very community it might have otherwise suppressed. A show of power in the land of the free, ending with the free claiming it as their own. And if the powers at large knew the result, perhaps they would have never bothered in the first place. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.